Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My name is Clayton Craddock, and my guest today is the legendary Matt Vander
Oh
Ende.
my God. The legendary. Hello, everybody.
Thank you
I
for
like that
joining me
one.
on my podcast. I really appreciate you taking time out. I have many, many questions to ask. And the first one, I want to find out where you grew up.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I mean, this is really a special opportunity. I think it's going to be pretty cool. I've always wanted somebody to talk about Broadway drumming in a way to bring it to people because I get lessons where people want to learn and learn that specific thing. So thank you very much. I grew up out in Oakland, California. That's where I'm from. I was born in San Francisco, but raised in Oakland. And that's where I went to school. And I spent like the first 33 years of my life before I moved out to New York City.
Did you always want to play drums when you were a little kid? Did you play like pots and pans or?
Yeah, I did. I kind of, it sounds cliche, but yes, I definitely did. And I used to play on the banisters too in my mom's house or my parents' house, I should
Was there
say.
something that influenced you into wanting to play drums?
Yeah, at the time, Oakland um, public schools were requiring that their students either be a member of the chorus or be a member of a music ensemble. And so being a member of the music ensemble, I mean, they would test you, and I wasn't a very good singer, so I went in to go try to be a member of the music ensemble, and they were testing in different instruments, and they had sensed that I had a natural enough rhythm, so they kind of gave me a pair of drumsticks, and I just kind of took to it. It was interesting. I took to it easier than the other ones. I tried trumpet and clarinet, and it didn't pan out. So
Were you
drums
in
was it.
were you in marching bands and like I don't know if you had one in middle school or at high school? Did you play in marching band or concert band or jazz band? What kind of musical ensembles did you play in?
Um, let's see. In grammar school, I did. Yeah, it's like school band stuff, but it was classically oriented as well. I played in the Oakland Youth Symphony by the time I was in seventh or eighth grade, I think it was.
Wow.
Maybe I can't really remember, but I was playing in the Oakland Youth Symphony. Um, and then after that, I was entering into high school and I was playing in the big band. And I went to a Catholic high school for all boys. So we didn't have like a nationally known marching band program or a drum corps program. We had a band, we had an orchestra and a jazz band. And so I played in all three. The jazz band there is where I got my experience in playing in like the Santa Cruz Jazz Festival, the Reno Jazz Festival, the Monterey Jazz Festival for high school bands. Um, and then I went to Interlochen for a summer. And then I came back and I played in the San Francisco Youth Symphony. So all this was kind of happening in like my high school, late grammar school, junior high school years. So I didn't do marching band. I mean, the marching band for our high school was just to show up at a football game and play a couple of like, charges like, go. It really wasn't like an organized marching band. It was more just like cheer, cheer, rah, rah, do well, Panthers.
What's interlocking?
Oh, Interlochen, it's, and I just forgot this because it's now changed their name, but it's still Interlochen Academy for the Arts. Um, it's a school a lot like Tanglewood, and they have a summer program and they have a year-round school program, and it's designed for art students that are doing dance, ballet, orchestra, jazz, and theater. And theater was kind of on the beginning edge of it when I was there back in the 80s. Um, Now I understand that it's a pretty big part of the program there. There's one percussionist that subs for Andy Jones at Wicked that teaches over there. Um, he says that it's a big program, and the jazz program there is instrumental in. It's the reason why I ended up leaving the classical world. I mean, I loved classical music. I've been playing for a long time, and I played in San Francisco Youth, and I went to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and I thought that that was a route that I was really going to go. But I was also playing a lot of drum set. I had played in a lot of big bands, and I was having more fun playing in big bands and playing in small group jazz bands. And like a lot of kids of my age in that era, Kiss was a huge influence on us for like being a rock and roll drummer and I couldn't get out of that too. So I was trying to juggle all that, like jazz and rock and roll and classical. Classical was mostly my parents wanted me to make sure that I had a formal education in music so that I could always use it as something to fall back on, either for teaching or to try to find a symphonic job, in one of the major symphonies around the country, around the world. And that was the direction I was heading. But I made a decision somewhere around my junior junior year at the conservatory that I think I wasn't going to pursue that. I finished my education, got my bachelor's, but I ended up, at that time I was in my heavy metal band and we were starting to record records, and I really enjoyed playing in the studio. When I'd done a couple records, I thought this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I loved recording albums. So I remember my teacher saying, like, it's really competitive in the classical world and you got to make sure you have a high edge on being one of the first choices. Everybody at that point was graduating from their separate conservatories or institutions around the country and going to join and try to play at the New World Symphony over in Florida with Michael Tilson Thomas. And I remember, like, all right, I think I'm going to use classical as like the backup and just kind of sub around town and do a few little stuff. And it was very instrumental in me going into the Broadway world because I had all that background. So I was able to sub on percussion books and play crossover percussion books and drum books. And I was hired a couple times as a percussionist between San Jose and San Francisco, while I was still doing drum set after the conservatory, by the time I had gotten into musical theater. So it was incredibly important. I didn't realize any of that until years later.
Mm. You mentioned Peter Criss earlier. I
Oh
grew up
yeah.
listening to a lot of different influences in my development as a musician.
Yeah.
What were some of your biggest influences as far as drummers are concerned, or even bands are concerned? I guess Kiss was one.
Yeah, Kiss was one of them. That's kind of the one that got it started for me. There's really so many of them. I remember, like, I went to a couple of jazz camps. I went to the Stanford Jazz Camp, and this is right around the time when people, or drummers, and at Interlochen as well, drummers were also turning me on to Steve Gadd, Vinny Colaiuta, Dave Weckl, these guys in the mid 80s and the 90s, when crossover fusion and jazz was becoming a thing. And the bands that I was listening to up to that age as well, because I'd started a heavy metal band, was like Metallica and Megadeth, and just I went to so many concerts in the arenas in the 80s of all these rock bands. I mean, Van Halen, Dokken, Dio, Black Sabbath, Bon Jovi, Def Leppard. Like, I had all these records. I was so into that rock and roll and that hair metal band stuff. And I would go to see anything that came around town. And it also meant that I would go and see, like, if Steve Gadd was touring with somebody or Dave Weckl was touring with somebody. I saw Dave Weckl with the Chick Corea band a couple of times. And
The original.
yeah, the original one, the original lineup of the Electric Band. Which was, yeah, I know. When I watched them, while I'm sitting there, I'm like this metalhead watching this guy and that band. And, I'd been studying with the teacher about how they specifically displace the entire beat of the tune by 16th note. And they start doing this each time they go around in a verse and or a chorus. And of course, I can't figure it out. I'm either like too young and I just can't hear it, that they either just played an odd meter measure of, like, 15, 16 or something, where they just displaced it by 1/8/16. But just the intellectual aspect of watching these guys play was so incredible. It was on a completely different level, but I think I remember the teachers I was studying with, they're like, you need to study everything and learn everything. Just, check out this drummer, check out that drummer, check out this record, check out that record, check out this band and that band. And,
Was
going to
this
all these concerts, it was huge.
was this more at the San Francisco Conservatory that you got
Yeah,
all this stuff? That you
San
that
Francisco
some
Conservatory Music. Yeah, a little bit. Like, it was high school, Interlochen, the conservatory, and private teachers. So I was studying with a couple of different private teachers at that time. And then my teacher at the conservatory, and at Interlochen, because we were also intensive, all musicians together. That's actually when I got turned on to Stevie Ray Vaughan, was at Interlochen. And also in high school, that was like my early days of playing big band. And, I was a freshman and the seniors were listening to all of the early big band records. And I had a teacher that he used to tell me that I should have, uh, uh, what's the drummer's name from the Village Vanguard? Mel Lewis, excuse me. God, I can't believe I don't remember his name. He said that I should have a daily diet of listening to Mel Lewis.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's just, like if you're going to play big band or listen to one of the great recording drummers, big band drummers of this era, you should listen to this guy. And, oddly enough, he was one of my favorite drummers as a big band drummer. And his bass trombone player is our bass trombone player at Wicked.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. When I first walked in there and I noticed who it was, and I was kind of nervous, and then I was like, Doug, you used to play with blah blah blah, and he was like, yeah, and I was like, oh man, I like listened to Mel Lewis all the time as a kid, as one of my go-to drummers for listening to all this stuff. And what was it like working with him and playing with him? It was really fun to just kind of listen to all his stories and so forth.
Now, you were at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music,
Correct.
and you were also in a band called Defiance.
Correct.
You got into metal music kind of at this. I don't know if it's at the same time, but you
I
actually
think so.
started a metal band called Defiance. Now, how did you go from big band, classical, to like heavy metal?
The theatrics behind Iron Maiden and those bands that would play those gigantic concerts that we would go see as young teenagers was a big part of the theatrics that was part of the allure of playing all this music. And then just being a drummer and wanting to be a part of all of that. Um, Classical music was what I was trained in, and I love it. I really do. Um, Jazz and big band was an evolution of moving in that direction, because it's exponentially more complicated and more intellectual to play. And I love playing in a large band, so big band's a lot of fun. Rock and roll and metal is something that, like as a young kid in the 80s, I don't think any of us didn't get bit by that bug. Do you know what I mean? Just the theatrics and the show behind it, and it was a lot of fun. Um, I wanted to be able to play like a Steve Gadd or a Vinnie Colaiuta, and still be in a band like an Iron Maiden or or a Dio, and yet still be able to you know play in a classical symphony orchestra. I liked it all, and ultimately I was kind of a big drum geek. Like I really loved drums. I loved the sound of the cymbals, and I loved learning like how you play all these different colors in the cymbals. But then sometimes you have to play really hard and heavy in order to be able to cover a metal band thing. But that was like playing bombastic was something that I never really liked to do. A lot of metal drummers, it's kind of required, but um, I would just you know learn all these different styles of playing and different genres of music. There was so much going on in the 80s, like all these different types of music. I would go to a U2 concert and then to a Dio concert, and then I could see Chick Corea and his electric band, or I could go play in a college band and play in a big band, and then there's symphony orchestras and what have you. I mean, it was an all-encompassing. There was always something going on of a different genre, and I would have friends that would like, got to check this out, you got to check that out, and I wanted to be a part of it all and like learn as much of it as I possibly could. um
You were in
you
the
know
Bay Area in the late '80s and early '90s, where Metallica came out of.
yeah,
Correct? Did you
yeah,
know them?
exactly.
Did you hang out with them?
um I didn't hang out with them. My band, so yeah, I didn't really answer your earlier question. Getting involved in heavy metal, um I was with some friends and we got together with a metal band, with playing heavy metal, and they turned me on to Metallica. It was like the Ride the Lightning record. I got hip to Kill 'Em All before that. I mean, after Ride the Lightning, but Ride the Lightning is what we started listening to. And I went to go see Metallica at the Kabuki Theater in San Francisco. And I think the double kick drum and the kind of like the aggressive nature of them as an early thrash metal band just threw me against the wall. I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And just the energy inside of that theater. And then seeing Metallica graduate to play at the Day on the Green, a huge, massive festival at the Oakland arenas or at the Oakland Stadium. Um, we started a band because we wanted to be like that. And we always wanted to, excuse me, meet Metallica. I had members of my band that had met James, or one member of our band knew Kurt Hammett's sister or ex-wife or something like that. They were all kind of around in the Bay Area. I was a little late on the game because I was probably 18, 19 at this point, and the guys that I was in the band with were already into their 20s, and Metallica was already into their mid 20s. So when they hung out at all these parties, we would have keg parties in the Berkeley Hills or Oakland Hills or San Francisco. They would go, but that was a little before my time. And once they became like a big band, they were playing um, at at uh, at big theaters and nightclubs in Berkeley and in Oakland and in San Francisco. So we tried doing a club gig at an old like Elks Club where it was actually us. I think our bass player put this gig together. It was us, Testament, and this is before Testament changed their name from to Testament. They used to be called Legacy, and Metallica wasn't going to play on the bill, but James and I believe Kurt came to the gig, and knowing that those two were coming to the gig brought a lot of people to that gig. And I remember it being really crazy there. Oh, and Exodus played that gig too. I don't know if you know people out there that know the old metal stuff. Exodus was a big Bay Area band from that era, and that was the closest I got to meeting and hanging out with James or anybody from Metallica. Um, I used to go to Kurt Hammett's house when he was on tour. Is it his wife or something? I can't really remember, but they were living out, I think, in El Sobrante and or El Cerrito. Um, we would go to his house because she would have a party or something, and he had like platinum records from all over the world of Metallica sales awards and like stacks of guitars and stuff. So I never got to hang out with them. I got close. We never really opened up for them. We were just kind of one of these metal bands that played around the Bay Area, that played with a lot of bands, and we toured with a lot of bands that either had opened for Metallica or toured with Metallica. But we were always like just that much close.
So you got out of college, then you went on tour with Defiance.
Yeah, I actually toured with Defiance before I finished the conservatory. We released our second record, and we got a tour with a band called Violence, and we toured the United States with them. So we were then going to tour the United States, and we did like Mexico right over the border in Tijuana. We would do Vancouver and or Toronto. I did that tour, and then I came back, and I needed to finish up at the conservatory, so I finished up my degree there, and then we were going to go on tour again. Right around this time when we were touring again, we were doing our third record. Things were getting a little rocky in the band, so I did finish up my career at my school at the conservatory, but my career with with Defiance was kind of balancing weird. I was kind of trying to tour with them and do that, but then I had to finish school. So I did take time off from school to tour, and then I would come back and finish school. And then I joined a band, and I lived in LA for about 6 months with that band doing that.
Ah,
Yeah.
did you go from LA to New York after that after
No,
LA?
I moved back up to the Bay Area. Um, I had played. I wanted to be like Jeff Porcaro and Steve Gadd so bad. I wanted to be in all the studios, and I was trying to figure out if I could do something like that. And the only way that I could make a record feel authentic was to play in a certain type of band of the styles that people were typically hiring drummers for. So I'd started a band with a couple members from the San Francisco Youth Symphony that I toured with. because the San Francisco Youth Symphony toured all over Asia when I was with them back in the 80s. And we did this hip hop funk like groove thing. It was like pre Jamiroquai, pre Maroon 5. It was a large band. It played a lot of funk and groove rhythms, and it had a lot of jazz influence because a couple of the guys that were in the brass section were members of the Berkeley High Jazz Band that was actually either nationally, they won national awards or statewide awards. I can't remember, but they were really great. And we had a rapper, and so we tried mixing in the hip hop thing with it too. And that was a band that I was really hoping would take off, and it never did. But I was doing that, and I was still so involved in the metal scene because I had been with this band that released records and we toured. I joined a band that moved to Los Angeles to record a record, so I was trying to balance that out. But after that, with the other band, which that was Laws Rocket, they were another Bay Area band that was pretty well known at the time. That whole thing kind of started to fall apart. So I moved back to the Bay Area, and I was trying to pursue that first band, which is called the Groove Shop at this point, and then balancing another rock band I was playing with, which was kind of a college band, and we were touring up and down the coast and just trying to stay busy and so on and so forth. And shortly after that, I had actually gotten married. I'd met somebody that was in the record industry, and we got married. And this is actually what brought me into the theater world, or got me closer into the theater world. She was a record executive, and I'd always known this, but she made it very aware to me just exactly how the record industry treats musicians and the bands. And the proverbial, if they throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks, is really true. And I had learned the hard way being in a signed band. I mean, Laws Rocket was signed to Sony Pony Canyon out of Japan. Defiance was signed to Roadrunner MCA Records out of New York. And there's one other band, Groove Shop, was getting interest from some labels, but not really. And then I tried auditioning for a couple different bands. I auditioned for White Zombie. I auditioned for Ugly Kid Joe. And
I remember them.
Yeah, you remember them?
Yes.
And with White Zombie and both with Ugly Kid Joe was the first experience I had on auditioning for a large nationally and internationally well-known band. They were platinum bands. And what I had learned was that they had already, part of me didn't understand why they're even having an audition. They had already selected their drummer by the time I was coming in. Ugly Kid Joe was a part of a cattle call. I was literally in a line of about, 40, 50 drummers outside of the studio somewhere in Southern California. And I'd heard that they had already selected their drummer. And I went in to go play a few of the tunes with them, and all they wanted to do was smoke pot. And I was like, okay, all right, well, let's play these tunes. And they were like, yeah, we'll let you know. And I was like, okay.
Was it like a publicity stunt?
I don't know what it was. I really don't know. And with White Zombie, the singer, should know his name, Rob Zombie.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't even there in the audition. It was the other people that were in the band. And they liked my playing, but they had said to me at the end of the audition, they said, we have a guy that we really like that we think we're going to go with, but, we'll take they videotaped my audition, and they said, we'll take this and we'll play it for Rob Zombie, and we'll see what he says, and we'll call you, and et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, okay. It just, those auditions for those kinds of bands and cattle calls, I guess it's pretty hard to land a gig unless you kind of have an in. I don't know.
So you were married to somebody in the music business, and you learned a lot about the truth about things that go on. You said there was a segue into how you got into theater.
Yeah, because at the time I was touring, trying to do more studio session stuff, and we were thinking of, how do I stay home more and not be on the road all the time? Touring like that, constantly on and off the road. I'd also gotten a gig with a country band, a country western band. She was based out of Modesto, but she was living in Nashville. So I did a Walmart's Country Cross America tour with her. And so I was gone. Um, I guess I decided that, I wanted to see if I could do more work at home and not tour as much and do more studio work. She wanted to move to Los Angeles, so I was considering doing a permanent move to Los Angeles with her because the industry was really there. Um, but I was studying with a teacher out of San Francisco. Um, a really good friend of mine that I played in San Francisco Youth Symphony with is a drummer by the name of Jim Boges. And he was with Sheryl Crow for at least 10 years. He's been with the Counting Crows for maybe close to 20 years, or I can't remember. But he turned me on to a teacher by the name of Greg Sudmeyer, who was the music director of one of those daytime talk shows in San Francisco. And this guy was a contractor in the Bay Area and a pretty well-known session drummer at the time. And it was him and his lessons that started to move me away from playing in a band, as well as my ex-wife was telling me just how hard it is for a band to actually become, well, signed and then picked up and then make a real living at it. So at one point, I decided I'm not going to tour as much anymore. I'm going to try to move my way out of that. And I asked him, I said, I'm looking for more work here in the Bay Area. I was thinking like freelance gigs. I wasn't quite sure. I didn't want to exactly do weddings, but I wasn't sure where to go because I was doing some studio session stuff, but it wasn't a lot. It was really like, you got to go to LA or Nashville if you want to do more studio work. He said, because he was also a music director, and he was music directing a community theater company based out of Redwood City called Broadway by the Bay or something like that. And he said, have you ever thought about musical theater? And I didn't mean to insult him, but I kind of laughed. I was like, you mean the stuff I played in high school? I'm like aspiring to be the next Dave Weckl or Steve Gadd. And I was like trying to be in a metal band touring around the world on huge stages. And he's talking about Broadway. And I was like, no, I never really thought about it. And he's like, well, you should think about it. And let me tell you why. And so he was a contractor for a lot of Broadway stuff that came through touring in San Francisco and that area. And he was a music director for a theater company in Redwood City. And so he started to list all the reasons why I should consider Broadway. And it started off with, I'm going to be playing with the very best musicians in that entire region. It's not a bunch of rock and roll heads that are trying to become the next rock star. It's very high-end musicians that take their job very seriously. All the big band stuff that I love to do, you're going to be playing with those people in the theaters. You can make a consistent and solid living doing this instead of on the road for 30 days. You have to negotiate your pay. Are you going to get a retainer when you're off the road? When you go into the studio session, you kind of are always managing yourself. He goes, thirdly, you'll be a member of the musicians union, which is going to give you substantial benefits, health benefits, a pension retirement program, and you're going to be able to work professionally instead of doing this. And I was like, yeah, but the music is like, like Oklahoma boom chuck stuff. And he's like, well, you should try to listen to it on a professional level and see what you think. I was like, okay. And he goes, so you think you're ready? And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, I have an opening at my orchestra. My drummer is actually leaving and I could hire you for a show. And he's like, you have your reading chops together. You have a classical education. You have this huge background of different styles and approaches to music. So would you like to do it? And I was like, yeah, well, what's the commitment? He's like 2 weeks. And I'm like, okay, that should be no problem. So I decided to dive into it, and it was a little more overwhelming than I thought, like collecting all the instruments together, getting the book together, which was just kind of a quick sketch. And like, how do you lead the band? How do you work with the music director? How do you play musically within all of these large people? And that first show that I did was Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, which has like a big dance section and like a, two beat, what do you call it? Music of that sort. And at the end of that run, all I remember is that I enjoyed myself more than I ever did playing in a metal band and playing and trying to kill myself going on the road with all this other stuff, I really, really enjoyed it. And I was like, you know what, I'd like to do this again. And I gave it another couple shots. Like I did that first season with him, which is 3 or 4 shows. And for the first time in many, many years, I was playing like a real musician, contributing to a large orchestra as if I was a real musician, but I was the drummer. So I could play like a drummer. I could set up a band like a drummer. And if the rock show came around, I would play like a rock drummer. I knew how to do that. That was easy. It was a big band show came around. I was pretty good at that. I wasn't Mel Lewis by any stretch of the imagination, but I was, good enough. And my biggest struggle, one thing, the one style that I never studied leading up to this point in my life was Latin music. And that was a serious hurdle to get over. And when it comes up in Broadway, yeah, what was my first Latin show? I think it was Kiss of the Spider Woman or something like that. I remember I was like, wow, this feels like it's way in over my head. And Greg had told me, he's like, maybe another drummer would be better for this show. And he had hired someone else that had a much deeper knowledge of Latin music playing in a big band. And I remember I was embarrassed because I kind of got fired. And I went into all those shows and I watched that drummer play and the way she played and approached that book. And I learned a lot. And I went in and I started studying more with my same teacher about uh, playing in different bands and approaching it as a Latin drummer. I still never really studied Cuban music to a degree of like an Ignacio Baroa or something, but um, I learned enough that I would play it with big bands, and I was competent enough and confident enough that when I played it on like in a Broadway band or a theater band, I could really drive the band and make it feel good. So it was that's how I mean, I know I'm a bit long-winded, but that's exactly how I got kind of pushed into that direction. It was by my own choice and by somebody who saw that I had this large background of experiences, and I was 25 at the time, so a good solid, close to, I want to say 12 years of playing experience from studying as a student on up to going through school and then touring and playing in a lot of different bands and that sort of thing. This teacher that got me involved in Broadway, since he was my drum teacher, one of his assignments he used to give me at the end of lessons to go out and buy these records. Like, buying records was a big deal to him. Like I should have a huge collection of these albums of different drummers and bands and genres of music. And that included buying theater records too. So if he had hired me for a show, I was to go buy the Broadway recording or London cast recording of that show and study how that drummer approached that show. Study the kind of music like from that show. What's the genre of music from that show, and where would you find that genre of music that influenced the writing of that show? And lucky for me at that time, I had played in funk bands, hip hop bands, metal bands, rock bands, country bands, studio sessions, classical bands, jazz bands, and big bands. That the only genre of music where I would really struggle was in Latin music. And so all of that other stuff was already kind of there, but I still continued to listen and study these other drummers and influences that led up to the record of something that I'm going to do, you know?
So you did this show, and did you say, you know what, it's time to move to New York City, or did you take a more circuitous route?
I, well, I did that show and then I became a member of that orchestra and I started doing their seasons there. So I was around 25 at that time. I didn't move to New York City until I was about 33. And something that my teacher had instilled in me was that when you're ready to go play on a Broadway show, then go. But he'd go, "You're not ready." He's like, you don't understand. It's like it's a really high pressure gig, and it's the kind of job where you really need to be ready to do it." So I stuck around and I tried getting every theater job that I could possibly get in the Bay Area. I was traveling all over the place. The main theater company, and actually this is a kind of a connection that you and I have. Main theater company I started working for later was Theater Works out in Palo Alto, and they did the second world premiere of Memphis.
Ah, that's right.
Yep. and I was the drummer on that show, and that's where I met Chris Yankee and David Bryant.
That's right.
And
That's
they had
right.
hired me. They had When Chris Yankee came out to the Bay Area, he was a little skeptical about their resident drummer at that theater being hired for the show. But then I hung out with Chris and I met David Bryant, and they learned about my background. And the music director they had hired at the time was a Galen. I forget his last name. Uh, it's Galen Jacobs, maybe. He played with the Gatlin brothers, and he was out in the Bay Area, and he and I hit it off. And I was a bona fide, full blown rock drummer from my earlier years, and so it really worked out for them on that show because that was a hard hitting, straight ahead rock book. Um, and I did that for years, and it was actually at that theater company where I met several people that were involved in the Broadway world, and through those contacts and influences, that's when I started making my inroads into moving out to New York City. I'd gotten a job out in San Francisco on a touring show called Some Like It Hot, but I was the percussionist up there. But I actually made more contacts and met more people directly involved with Broadway in New York at Theater Works in Palo Alto. Um, I met Lynn Schenkel out there. I did a show with her. I met Joe Mowat out there. Um, I met a lot of actors out there that were working on Broadway. Uh, David Bryant and Chris Yankee. Those were probably one of the key ones. And I know I'm forgetting some people, but it was through all of that that I decided, okay, and I worked with a lot of musicians that had toured around the country on Cats, on Les Miserables, on, Phantom of the Opera. And people were starting to nudge me to say, like, you should get out of here and go work and you should try New York because you're working all the theater jobs here in the Bay Area, and this is it. This is the top level it is here outside of New York City. I had learned by touring a Broadway show that outside of New York City, everything is at that level. It's at Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, the major theater markets outside of New York City. It's a season of like 4 or 5 shows a year, and they last for about a month, and you just kind of freelance. And that's the top end of it. If you really want to take it to another level, you need to move to New York City. And New York City was the most intimidating thought in my entire life. I mean, LA seemed easier to me. I was like, I kind of was somewhat involved in LA. And plus, I grew up out on the West Coast. But New York City just seemed like, no way. The best drummers on the planet are in New York City. I can't compete in that place. But moving out to the city and then spending my time breaking in and doing that, it was the best decision I ever made in my life. I mean, that is for sure.
So, what year did you move to New York City?
2004, early 2004, like February, March. Yeah, something like that.
Did you already have a gig lined up?
I didn't. I had, okay, so this is what I had done before that. I did a show, Smokey Joe's Cafe, out at this same theater company. And a couple of the cast members I had met had always said, "You're welcome to crash on my couch if you ever want to come to New York and check it out." So I cashed in on that a couple of times. I made trips out to New York City. At this time, JetBlue was a new airline, and they were offering like $40 tickets to go to New York. It's something super cheap. It's like $80 round trip. It was really ridiculous. So I would fly out there, spend a week out there, and then fly back in between doing theater shows or what have you. I really went into learning Broadway and wanting to do Broadway 110%. I had known that my lessons from not getting certain auditions at gigs or not getting the job that I wanted or a band not doing what I wanted to do was partly that I felt like maybe we as an entity or a band or me as an individual wasn't putting 110% into that particular gig. And I felt like I couldn't half-ass going into Broadway. I needed it to be an integral part of the fabric of who I am. Like I really want this. And so in that process, I have to learn all these styles, and I have to be a drummer that's going to be hireable in New York City because there's a lot of drummers to compete with. So I started flying out to New York, and I met and hung out with Joe Mowat, that he had introduced me to Billy Miller. I don't know. Did you ever meet him?
Yes,
And so,
indeed.
yeah, exactly. So Billy Miller was sitting. He had just gotten the Fiddler on the Roof gig, or he was actually over at Thoroughly Modern Millie. And so I met these guys, and they invited me to come sit in the pit. And then I would fly back to California And the main question I started to get at this point was, well, are you living here or are you going to move here? Because once you kind of get into meeting a few of these drummers and they invite you to sit in the pit, the next question is, do you live here, or when are you going to be here, or are you available? Because I know from myself now, having sat on a show for 15 years, that I would then start to vet them. If I got a good vibe from them, I would start to wonder, like, do you think they could handle the book? Now, if they're not living there or they're just kind of visiting, then it's a little bit like, well, yeah, give me a call when you're here because I can't use you. And that pushed me to just like, okay, I got to make the move and I got to move out to New York. So I moved out to New York in 2004 and I didn't have a gig. I just had savings. I was going to live in the living room with a person I had met that did a show out in the Bay Area. And Billy Miller was kind of starting to look for a sub, but he wasn't quite sure yet. And so I think in there's like 4 or 5 months or something, then he said, hey, I lost a sub. Would you be interested in learning the book and, coming out, and trying it? And I was like, yeah, I can do it. And I, watched the show and I learned the book and I did everything I needed to in my due diligence to be ready to go do the show. And that's kind of how I got started subbing. But I didn't have a gig coming into the city. I was coming in cold. I made all those old classic cold calls. I had good return phone calls. I had terrible return phone calls. I had one of my best experiences, and it's a real bummer we lost this one, but Dave Radicek was one of the first guys I called when I came into town. And he gave me a call right back. He didn't need to. I mean, this is like one of the most consummate, decorated Broadway drummers there is. And he asked me to come in and watch the book. I gave him kind of a rundown of what I do, who I am. And I mean, he's an incredible player. I was like, I actually would rather just study with you than sub for you because you're such an incredible player. So much happened for me so quickly towards the end of that first year. And a lot of that was because a couple of drummers got gigs. One of them was Gary Seligson and the other one was Sean McDaniel. So I had met them by the time I moved out there. And actually, Gary, I worked with, and this is going to sound crazy. I was still going out to California to do a couple shows with TheaterWorks at this moment while I had moved to New York City. And it was all at my own expense, just because I wanted to do this other job. The job that I did in California was an Andrew Lippa show called Little Princess, I think. Gary Seligson was hired on that show. And I had met Gary briefly because Chris Yonke had me come in and watch, because he was at that time also associate music director of Aida on Broadway. So I met Gary there. And Gary was about to leave to start Wicked. I flew out to California and I did a show with Andrew Lippa at TheaterWorks, and Gary was the drummer programming all the African stuff on a SBD 20. So I worked with Gary side by side, and that's kind of how I got to know him. And that's what started my connection with Wicked. But at that time when I went out there to do that, I was just started subbing at Fiddler on the Roof. That was my very first Broadway show.
Yeah,
and I've got kind of,
I was going to ask you about. Well, so what was it? First of all, before you go on, what was it like subbing your first show on Broadway?
Terrifying.
Let's think of a friend of mine called subbing as a drummer on Broadway like a 2.5-hour heart attack.
It is, or it's like giving birth. And I'm a guy, I don't know what that's like, but I can imagine what it's like. Maybe giving, shitting a basketball. That's about how it might feel.
Painful.
The visuals, yeah, exactly. It's painful.
It feels good when it's over, though.
It sure does.
It's an analogy, man. Like, damn.
I know. I've told other people this, and it's genuinely no lie. This isn't from some cliche story. Billy Miller called me and said, I've got a date for you at Fiddler on the Roof. And from that moment on, I didn't sleep well at night. I was nervous because I knew that each day, tick tock, was closer to my first time subbing on Broadway. I knew what the pressure was and how incredibly critical it was to kick ass that first show. You're first out, you know what I mean? On my way to the Minskoff Theater to sub, I actually kind of wished I was going to get hit by a cab, so I had an excuse to not go.
That's funny.
So I was nervous, man. I was able to control it because I had a classical education and I had taken classes at the conservatory about controlling my nerves, about getting ready for auditions, because auditions are nerve wracking, especially in the classical world. You've got to learn all this repertoire and it has to be flawless. And I approached playing Fiddler on the Roof the same way. Every single note I wanted to play and feel like the way that Billy plays that book. And there happened to be a particularly difficult music director, a very good one, but just very particular, that was conducting that show. That was Kevin Stites. He was running that company. And he was the real deal. Just like, you know, I had Herbert Bloomstead. I had played under Herbert Bloomstead and under, you know, Michael Tilson Thomas a couple times with the San Francisco Youth Symphony. And at the conservatory, I was always under the microscope from the principal percussionist of the symphony and my main teacher there, Ray Froelich. So every single tiny, you know, difference in playing, they could pick it out and tell me what's wrong with my playing or what I did wrong. And I knew that Kevin was the same way. He heard everything. So that put an added amount of pressure on top of it. And I had noticed, and sometimes that when you're a new sub, sometimes it's not the regular music director there, which takes some of the pressure off. But in this particular instance, Kevin was like, I have to be there for the sub's first drummer, for the drummer's first show. And we were on stage. So I was really nervous. I remember like all my training from the years of the conservatory and the education in Interlochen, and then my years of experience of playing in bands and touring and playing in front of large audiences. I couldn't control my thoughts. So I was able to fall back on my training and just go, calm down. You know this stuff. You've been playing this stuff in your sleep. You could quite literally close your eyes and just play the show without any thought. But your mind's racing at 1,000 miles an hour, you know? And it's like at the end of each tune, my stomach would get more and more tight and my throat was tight. And I could, you know, I was trying to drink water and I was worried that Kevin noticed that I was nervous or not, you know? And by the time the show was over, this huge weight was lifted off my shoulders. And I felt like I was going to sleep for the first time in a week or two. And I felt like I could relax. And I got a compliment from Kevin. I was told that he never compliments people. And he complimented me. And a couple of the people that walked by had complimented me. And I felt like all my hard work actually paid off. Like the old fashioned way. No politics, no BS. Old fashioned, good old hard work actually paid off. And it was great, man. I mean, that was kind of how it got started. That got Larry Lelly to say, come play over at Assassins. It got Gary to kind of say, okay, you subbed for Kevin Stites. That's a pretty big deal. The show's not that hard, but it's just playing in a large orchestra in front of a very particular music director that could easily make or break your career in a matter of, you know, 30 seconds. It opened up some doors for me. I was really glad that it paid off and I put in the hard work. Sometimes politics can dictate things differently, but it did pan out the right way, you know, and that kind of led my way into other stuff. There were also a couple drummers that I would call. I've been subbing at Fiddler and I just started subbing at Assassins. And Assassins was for, oh man, what's the music director's name there that does all the Sondheim shows? Help me out here.
A woman?
No, a guy. He's
William?
a drummer that,
Oh no.
maybe I'll get it to you later. Anyway, he was another one that was a particularly really hard music director because he's a drummer himself. And I had been approved on Assassins playing at 54, where I don't know if you've played a show there yet, but there would be half the orchestra on one of the sections of whatever over the stage and another half of the orchestra on the other side of the theater. So you were playing against this weird delay you'd hear from the other side of the orchestra through a hot spot, and then you'd hear the stage, which is kind of in front of you, and everything was in three different, like, time signatures, it felt like, in like three different areas of the theater. And then you had Gimignani, Paul Gimignani, thank you. Paul Gimignani would conduct so far ahead of the beat that I wasn't clear what I was supposed to do. I was, I leaned on that bass player so hard, and yet you're the drummer, so you can't let them guide you. You have to still lead the band. But Gimignani had a very special way of pulling the band along and making the show feel incredible, while the singers, because the singers were way behind the beat. The band on the other side of the orchestra was like a time delay. And then Gimignani is way ahead of the beat. So somewhere the band and the singers and the other side of the orchestra and Gimignani, the whole thing just kind of worked. And through these experiences, Gary wasn't going to hire me for Wicked. He had said, I've got everybody that I need. And so, kind of to circle back to my original point, Sean McDaniel got a show. All of a sudden, there was this vacuum of space for subs. And so Rent, Jeff Potter had called me. Sean wasn't over at Chicago, but Ronnie Zito called me. Gary had said, okay, I think now I have a spot. I think I could use you. I was already over to Sassen, so that's about to close. And then I was at Fiddler on the Roof. And there was one other that I can't remember what I got called for. So I was trying to like figure out how to learn all these books. And then it just so happened that I was about to go in and start learning Wicked when I had said to Gary, I said, I wouldn't mind going out on the road. I loved touring. I kind of stopped doing it, but I wouldn't mind going out on the road with the theater company or a show.
So I'm assuming you weren't married at this time.
No, that's right. I skipped that part. I had gotten divorced. After I got divorced was another one of the catalysts that pushed me to make the final move to New York City. So I was single at this point. Gary said, I think we have an opening for First National of Wicked. It's going to go out pretty soon, and I'll throw your name into the hat at Michael Keller. I had met Michael Keller when I was working with Gary Seligson out in California. Michael Keller was interested in contracting the show. His wife has a sister or family member out in the Bay Area, so he was out there visiting. He came in, and I met Michael Keller that way. And oddly, the shows that I was subbing on were all Keller shows. I've never worked for John Miller. I've played with John Miller. I've just never worked for him. It's really bizarre how that happens. But he gave my name to Keller, and Keller called me and said, hey, I remember meeting you out in California. Would you be interested in possibly doing the First National of Wicked? And I was like, yeah, what do I need to do? And he goes, well, you need to sub at Wicked because the new music director is going to take that tour out, and then you need to get approved, and you need to do it pretty fast. When do you think you can get in there and do it? And I was like, I don't know. And he goes, okay, well, let me talk to Gary. So some time went by, right? And this is all happening within that first year that I had moved to New York City. It was really slow at first, and then it picked up and it just snowballed. And so I remember I turned down a couple of sub jobs to learn the Wicked book because I thought this is my opportunity to do this. And Wicked, to me, was my wheelhouse like you wouldn't believe. It was a hard rocking hit show. It had, I was playing like a real drummer, all these different styles. Like the Police and reggae styles, the ska feels, the rock and roll stuff was like right up my alley. And then the classical stuff that book has to cross over was also right up my alley. It was a traditionally conducted show with very little click track. And the electronics was not completely up my alley, but it wasn't a lot involved in Wicked. So I was like, I could learn this thing. And I remember it came together really quickly. And Keller had called me and said, have you subbed at Wicked yet? And I said, no. And he goes, oh man, I need to know what's going on because we have to get somebody in place for this tour right away. And I said, okay, I'll learn. I'll get in there. And so he had called Gary and said, we need to get Matt to sub at the show. Just get him in one or two times to see if, Bob Billig was the music director. It's like to see if Bob would approve him because Bob wants to get a drummer set up. And they had a couple other people in mind. So I went in and subbed, but I had to get that book together quite literally in a week and a half or 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And actually, Joe Mowat and Lynn Schenkel are pretty instrumental in that process. They went on a big vacation, I think, and they wanted me to babysit their dogs, and they were living out in Nyack. And so I went out there, set up Joe's drums, set up a carbon copy of the Wicked setup, and I practiced there like 6 to 8 hours a day for about a week, getting ready to sub on that show. And then that's how that happened. And classically, I said to all the other books I was subbing on, hey, I'm going to take out the first national, but if you still need me, I'm here through the end of the year until February. And my phone stopped ringing the very next day.
Oh no, really?
Yeah. I
Uh,
mean, not quite that
yeah,
bad, but
no.
it
They were
was,
like,
yep. They were like, need to find a new guy. Bye. See ya.
a lot of people don't know what we mean by that. That means
I
hanging up
know.
the phone.
I know. And I meant to circle around for a quick second. There was a few phone calls I made to a couple of other drummers that were big name drummers in the Broadway scene. I won't mention the names, but this is like kind of just as I was just starting to sub. They gave me like the worst reaction on the phone you can possibly imagine. Like, hey man, San Francisco is a great place to live. Why in the world do you want to move out here? There's no work. And he's like, and I have no space for you. Click.
Ah, man. I did your first subbing show at Wicked, and you knocked it out the park, and you got the gig. Then you went on
Right.
out on tour.
Right.
And how long were you out on tour with Wicked?
1 year, like almost exactly 1 year.
How
And I
long?
didn't take a, yeah, go ahead.
How long was the tour supposed to go out? Was it supposed to go out just 1 year?
No, it was open ended. We had Wicked was just beginning to explode at this point. So Wicked had opened in 2003. Tour opened in February of '05 in Toronto. The producers, for whatever reason, weren't totally sure how the show was going to do. So the idea was that it was open ended. The vibe was that the show's a huge hit, so it's probably going to keep touring for years to come. But they weren't sure because we had only sold tickets through to uh, Toronto starting in February. But by the time the 2 month run in Toronto was over, the entire calendar year was sold out. Yeah, the entire year was sold out. So it was actually so sold out. The demand was so high that by the time we got into Chicago, they wanted to set up a brand new company to sit down in Los Angeles. So they were going to take the sets from the first national tour, leave them in Los Angeles, rebuild an entire tour, and then reopen the tour starting in San Francisco after the first 2 month Los Angeles run.
Wow. I keep hearing how difficult Wicked is to play, and you did it in a week. I've heard so many stories like, oh my God, this is the most difficult show I've ever done in my entire life. Why is it so difficult? And why do you think it's so
Um,
difficult?
the show itself is difficult. It's a kind of a nonstop, start to finish, high intensity show. It crosses over in genres of music for a drummer to be able to put on several different hats throughout the show all the time. So you quite literally go from a Stuart Copeland feel to a full-on 80s rock and roll ballad feel to a very aggressive, loud, like borderline punk feel to being a classical musician and being a typical, two beat Broadway musician. And this is happening throughout the show all the time. And the hard part is it's a very large orchestra by Broadway standards. It's 23 of us. And with a band that large, with the separation that we had in the pit, it was hard to play that show and drive it. They really, I mean, Wayne Salento is the choreographer, and he's very used to the older school style of like what do you call it? A chorus line style of drumming. And that's kind of the approach that you have. The drummer is the transmission of that show. Why I felt like it came to me easily is that there's one tune in the middle of that show where you quite literally Gary's Gary's explanation of the description of this tune is perfect. It's like Bartok meets Metallica. You are like a Metallica metal drummer in the middle of a symphony orchestra, and there are time changes, there's retards, there's accelerandos, and on top of this, it's the big moment when the lead of the show is casting her spells. This is a tune called No Good Deed, and it is just a brutal drum part. It's something that most drummers do not know and or get or would understand. And me being a metal and a rock and roll drummer and a classical drummer, it came to me like that. I was like, oh, I get this. I mean, it just happened to happen. And I feel like, and I've been told this a couple times, Stephen Remus had told me this, Michael Keller had told me this, and Gary had told me this, that I was the perfect fit to take over that book just because of my background and my specific what I do. I know that I'm not the best fit for all Broadway shows. I'm not even close. Like, I can't do what Andreas does. There's just no way. And so I wouldn't work out at in the Heights, And Alex Lackamore was our music director at Wicked when I was taking over. And he was also the piano player, like right before that. When I subbed there, he was the piano player. And so there's that kind of level of intensity that was in the pit all the time. And he was very instrumental in getting that book and that feel of how that show should happen together. And Wicked feels like it's the kitchen sink being thrown at you all the time. And because it's a show that's organic and it moves and it's got a lot of motion, it's not the same show every single night. You can listen to 2 recordings a year apart and it sounds remarkably similar. But when you're inside the show, inside your head, it's different all the time. It's different with what's going on. It's different with what the music director is doing. And that particular show, the music director, that chair isn't as specific as like a symphony orchestra, right? That music director is directing everything that's going on stage and is keeping the orchestra together. And most of that pressure falls on the drum book. So when you're keeping the time together and they're worried about cues, they've got cues and stage cues, and they're conducting the orchestra at the same time, they don't have time to worry about if the drummer's got his shit together. So I think that kind of pressure makes that book and that show particularly hard. It is not an easy thing to do. I've had a lot of drummers come in and watch and play. Some drummers, it fits well with them, and some drummers, they think they can do it. I've had a couple of crash and burns, nothing really bad, but a couple early on where I'd learned I need to vet my subs more often. Sometimes it's an undue amount of pressure that could be on somebody. So I feel like if they don't have a significant amount of Broadway pressure, I don't want to put them through that. Do you know what I mean? Because it's a particularly large show.
How did you actually get the show? You were working with
Gary. Oh, the Broadway company?
Yes. You came. You did you did the tour for a year. Then what happened?
I was on tour, and Gary was going to leave to go do Tarzan. He was going to work with Phil Collins and originate the book for Tarzan. So he had put in his notice at Wicked, but he was still, I think, doing about a year. I'm sorry, he was still doing about a month left. And they had decided to choose his replacement out of the subs that were already on the Broadway book. I threw my hat in the ring. I knew that Bob Billig, who was our music director on the Wicked tour the first year I went out, was going to leave the tour and take over on Broadway. Did that have some influence on it? It might have. There are a lot of music directors that take drummers show to show to show to show. So it probably would have made him a lot more comfortable knowing that I was going to go with him. But he also knew that Alex and Stephen Remus were choosing a drummer to replace Gary based upon the subs that were in New York. And they're all really fine drummers. I think they just weren't finding the right fit to take over the chair. It's one thing to sub, it's another thing to actually own the chair. Your personality is kind of a big part of that as well, and how you interact with the orchestra and so forth. And I had a whole year's experience on the road. I'd opened up the first national tour, so I was well used to the kind of pressure that was coming to that particular player on that book. And I think Bob going over to New York might have been an influence. I'm not totally sure, but at one point we were playing down at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and Remus had come down to watch me play. I didn't really know this, but I was told later that he came down because he was like, we're not quite finding who we want, but I'm going to go check out the first national drummer, because he didn't know me. By the time I had subbed there, he was only conducting a few more times. This is like right around the time when Kristen and Adina were still in the show, but they were leaving, and he was already on to doing different stuff. So Alex's, other music directors had heard me play, but not so much Aremus. And Aremus didn't come out to set up the show on the road. He had left that up to Bob, who was the music director, and Michael Keller was around a lot. So there were some influences like, Keller and Gary and Bob saying, come listen to Matt, come check him out. You might find your fit there. And apparently he did come listen to me. And apparently, I believe that's when they made their decision, is that when he saw me play at the Kennedy Center there. Did I say Lincoln Center or Kennedy Center? Whatever it was.
Kennedy.
Yeah, thank you. When he'd seen me play there, which is a similar size theater to that of the Gershwin, I think he was like, okay, that's our guy. And it was shortly after that that Keller had called me and said that Aremus wants you to come take over the book. And I was like, wow. It felt a little bit like it was coming out of the blue, because I really didn't have any idea that they were seriously considering me. I think it happened pretty quickly. I'm not completely sure how it happened, but I know that that's some sort of chain of events in that what have you. And I think it was the performances there at the Kennedy Center that it kind of sealed the deal, so to speak.
So you got the job as the drummer for the hit Broadway musical Wicked.
Right.
How did you feel after that? Do you like, oh my God, I got to the top of my profession? Like, what was going through your mind, and when did everything kind of start to settle in after that?
Yeah, that is how I felt about my Broadway career, that like, okay, this is the pinnacle. I'm not going to get a better drum book or a better show than this. I mean, I really felt that. I really loved the show. I felt like this is one of the few Broadway shows that I was really excited about playing every single night. All Broadway shows are fun. This one in particular was like something I totally fell in love with. And taking out the first national tour, I never got bored a single night. I mean, I was never even tired going on. I loved playing that book. So taking over on Broadway, it was hard replacing Gary on a couple different levels. On a personality level, he was the in-house contractor and a very charismatic guy, and the band really loved him. So it was hard replacing him on that level, because I'm the outsider guy who a lot of them don't remember when I subbed there, because it was a year ago. And a lot of them had never really met me because I'd only moved into the city 2 years ago, or 2.5 years before, or whatever it was. And there's a little bit of hazing and like, who is this guy? Because, they all had their friends that they wanted to get the job, and none of them got the job. They gave it to the outsider, and an outsider from California on top of that. I had to, I guess the sense was, well, it's the same show. It should feel the same, but it doesn't. It was quite literally like taking the transmission out of a car and putting in a new one, and grinding the gears a bunch of times, trying to get used to it. My sense of feel, my sense of time, my sense of how I put things and where I move the band or don't move the band was entirely different than Gary. I mean, they felt that I was the closest to representing him on that book. So they liked my energy level, and I'm an easy person to get along with. So that part of it worked out for me pretty quickly, but getting to like where my feel was and getting the band used to how I play the show, even though it was the same notes, was enough to rub a bunch of people the wrong way for a little while. And it takes time to break in. And I had to learn how to diplomatically be a person that is going to make them feel that I was the right choice, but then give them enough conviction in my playing that I am their right choice, and that even though this may not feel right now, totally, you're going to get used to it and appreciate it. I mean, there's a certain level of conviction you have to dig in, and I had to learn that within the first couple of months, because I was a little overwhelmed at first. I didn't quite know how to take where this was all coming from. And I remember speaking to I spoke to Dave Radicek about it. I spoke to Larry Lelly about it. And who else did I speak to? I might have spoke to Gary a little bit about it too, just about, how do you approach this and make this work, and, deliver yourself as a person, and literally, quite literally convince them that this is the best choice that they possibly could have made. You know, with some people, it's like, oh yeah, he's perfect. But other people, it could be a little bit wonky at first. And because I knew the show so intimately from being on the road with it for a year, it was like taking a square peg and putting it into another round hole. And so shaving off all those edges to get it all to fit and to work out. Once it did work out, then I was getting compliments from like the lead trumpet, different heads of the orchestra saying like, you know, your playing's really great and we're really glad to have you here. And it was a little bit rocky at first, but you know, now it's like as good as we ever could possibly have imagined it. They were very nice compliments, but it takes a minute when you replace the drummer. I can't explain it any other than just like putting in a whole new transmission and engine into a car, and it's just going to perform differently. Whether it's better or worse, it's just different. You know what I mean?
Did you keep all the subs that were there before?
I did at first, yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I kept all of the subs, and then not too many of them have changed over the years. Some have gone and come back and so forth. But I've brought in a couple of others that were on my own. But the ones that I inherited were like Keith Krupe, Bill Lanham, Eric Poland. I think there's a couple others, but they've left, and I can't remember who they were. But you know, anyway, yeah.
Wow, and that was 2006.
That was 2006 when I took over. Yeah.
And you've been doing it ever since.
Yes.
Now, do you ever? I asked this to Bill Lanham. Do you ever get bored, or like, man, I can't believe I've been doing this for 15 years? You know, I don't feel like. Well, you don't really feel like not doing it anymore, I guess. But
Yeah.
how do you keep things fresh?
Oh, that's a good question. I've had shows where I'm really tired, and for whatever reason, what's going on around my life has made it exhausting for me that day. And I go in to play the show, and I'm not inspired or something. Some shows I have sat down and just turned everything off and tried to fall in love with the drums all over again. And then from the top of the show, really focus and enjoy every single hit that I play to the drums. Enjoy the sound of that tom, enjoy the sound of the kick drum, enjoy the sound of your cymbals. And it could help take my mind off of playing the same repetitive thing over and over and over again. It could help separate, like, I love listening to this that night, I love listening to this that night. And that's just like band-aid stuff. Really, to keep it fresh, I try to practice different styles and change it up in my practice room, or do some other gigs to do something different and fresh, so that it takes me away from it, so that when I come back to the show, it feels really good, you know? And the percussionist Andy Jones had told me one time, if you ever feel stale about the show, go out into the breezeway where the Gershwin is and sit there for a few minutes, right around half an hour, as people are starting to pile into the theater. You see this young girls and young guys or teenagers going on first date, or, you know, older couples or what have you, theater goers, and they're enjoying it and they're excited to see the show. You know, little girls dressed up in a witch outfit or what have you. And it does definitely, like, wow, people really love the show. They're experiencing something for the first time in their lives. And, you know, that's part of my job, is to deliver a great experience to them. And the show and everything around it is so much bigger than what I feel about it that night musically. You know, I mean, I feel like that I earned my place there, but that I'm also really lucky and really blessed to even be there and playing, you know, making a living as a musician. It seems so crazy sometimes, you know, and with everything that's going on at the end of each night, I don't remember too many performances where I wasn't happy. I was always pretty happy. I never disliked being there. There were times where I was tired. There were times where I was sick. And there were times where I was dealing with some vertigo, you know, probably about a year before the pandemic hit. And I was really more worried about anything else. I went through tendonitis on the show. I went through a hip problem on the show, a couple knee problems, and the hand tendonitis problems. But I ended up working through them. And it just helped shape me more as a player and really kind of appreciate the music and playing drums and being a musician, and like how fortunate I feel like that I could do this for an actual living, you know?
Interesting. You have a lot of
Yeah.
injury. What the injuries come from playing the show, and have you figured out a way around getting more injuries?
Yeah, the first ones were, well, when I got into the show, there's a very finite amount of space, and Gary's a smaller person than me. Like I have a longer reach than him, and my legs are longer, so the kit felt really tight. And I tried moving it out as much as I could, but there are those baffling walls that could not move because on the other side of these walls were other musicians. So I was in a cockeyed position, and at first, I guess it thought it wasn't going to be a big deal, but then once I started having an injury problem, I started seeing a doctor about kinesiology and trying to, redistribute a flow of blood into my tendons because that's, my muscles were really tight. And so I had to go back. I took a couple lessons on the molar technique from Danny Gottlieb, and because he was a big student of you know, what's his name out in Jersey, the famous one. Um, anyway, he had helped me with my grip, and I tried approaching things a little bit differently, and I was really focusing uh, on my posture and focusing on how I was playing the drums. And I also realized that this hitting the drums the same way every single night was part of the problem. So I started mixing it up. Like I'd lead a fill with my left hand one night, or I lead a fill with my right hand another night. It really forced me to think hard, and it forced me my muscles to play different things because I wasn't doing enough outside work where I was playing and doing different stuff. That the repetitive stress of the same thing over and over again was part of what was contributing to the injury that I was getting, and the stress overall was a big part of it. So like lowering my stress and changing my diet to more of an anti-inflammatory diet was just a bit of it, but really working on my grip and relaxing and just changing it up and doing different stuff. And then seeing this doctor that would help with like kind of some blood flow or what have you. It took, man, I think 6 or 8 months of like this up and down kind of process, like good nights and bad nights, before I was able to get over it. And the doctor that I went to helped because I was overwhelmed. I was like, is my career over? And he had helped me believe in myself that we're going to work through this. You're going to continue to work through this and continue to play. You're going to have nights where you're in a lot of pain. You're going to have nights where you're going to feel good about it. And I was doing a lot of icing at the end of the show, this like ice therapy and stuff. All of it helped, but the biggest part of it was just trying to become a drummer again and do different stuff. And like, part of it was like playing a fill a little differently every night. Sometimes I blow it a little bit. People give me a bad look, and I'm just like, yeah, this is part of my therapy, dude. You have no idea.
It's funny.
Yeah.
So did you doing something different? Did you go back into your like woodshed and then listen to some prong or
Yeah,
play some
I
different
did.
music? As far as Broadway, what advice would you give someone who's interested in playing Broadway shows? If a drummer says, I want to play Broadway musicals, what do I need to do, Matt?
Yeah. I would, you know, a lot of things have changed in the last decade, how you approach music, how you break into a music scene. And so I don't want to feel like I'm outdated or old school, but I still think that music, unlike the internet, is something that takes a lot of time and a lot of hours and a lot of conviction and a lot of love to make wherever you want to go, make it happen for you. And so with that said, um, I think being a Broadway drummer where you want to sub, you want to eventually own your own chair, and you want to be able to make a career out of it, hopefully a long one. Um, Start at the community level, start at the regional level, even go play high school shows, get a lot of experience, learn all the different styles that are involved in the Broadway show, and play every single gig you possibly can. Join bands that are going to give you the vast amount of playing experience. And because on a Broadway show, if there's a specific aspect of your playing that's weak or not well developed, it's really going to come out on the show. You know what I mean? And I think starting at a point where you can develop an experience. Like going into a Broadway drummer to me is just like joining a band. If you want to be a rock and roll drummer, you're going to join bands, and you're going to start with bands. You're going to keep playing with bands, and hopefully one day that you're going to end up touring the world on arenas and making a bunch of money and making a bunch of records. But you're going to start at the very bottom level with a garage band. Same thing with a Broadway show. You should start playing in very simple shows that give you the playing experience and the amount of um, you're just playing experience to develop yourself to get ready to go and play on a Broadway show. Because a Broadway show is the professional level, where sometimes people break right in and they have no background experience. Maybe they just came from school, but they're going to, I mean, it might be just a specific show, but if you really want to make a career out of it and work all the different types of shows that there are, because there's a ton, rock and roll shows, R&B, Latin, traditional, classical, you name it. If you want to be able to work that vast variety of shows and make a career out of it, I think you need to start with just developing the repertoire, you know, essentially like getting ready to play in the symphony orchestra. You learn all the repertoire to get ready to play. You learn all the Broadway type of repertoire to get ready to play and do shows, and try to get yourself called on stuff to get you prepared and ready to go. And off Broadway shows and off Broadway shows, you know, the more experience you get, the easier it's going to be, and the more serious people are going to take you when you start breaking into the Broadway scene, you know.
What is something that a drummer that is subbing on a Broadway show, what are the things that they should never do?
When you walk in to play the show that's exactly like the regular drummer. What you should never do is walk in there and play the show like you're trying to impress the music director and you do your own thing, like some fancy fill, some fancy whatever, because all it's going to do is piss off everybody. Playing wise, I think that's probably the fundamentals of being a sub, is that your job is to sound exactly like the regular player. And that's how you get noticed and break in. But if you go in there and you are eager to show off your own skills and like, this is who I am, it never works out. So that's a never do. Never go in there and piss off the people. Don't, you know, be easy to get along with and be accommodating to the point where you're just, you know, people look forward to talking to you and hanging out with you. You know, if you're somebody that rubs people the wrong way and you're abrasive on a Broadway show, the music director may like you a lot, but the regular player is probably going to hear from other people that they were difficult to be around, and then they won't call you back. Broadway's a big business. You know, the companies and the producers and the shows, they make a lot of money. So it's really not about you. It's about being a member of the orchestra and a part of the product. And so what you shouldn't do is try to make it about you. You know, tell people that, like, you know, you don't actually want to be there. This is beneath you. This is whatever that is. Being there and a part of a Broadway show is being a part of a kind of like being a part of a family. You know, you could imagine if you're a member of a family that no one wants to be around, that's just going to make your life miserable. Imagine if you're on a show for 20 years, 10 years, 15 years, and no one gets along with you. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it could be just a nightmare. But I think getting along in personalities when you're sitting on a show, because you've already been hired for your playing ability. So how you connect and your chemistry with the other players is critical. So what not to do? Be a jerk.
All right. On the flip side, as a sub drummer on Broadway, what should you always do?
I've heard this from music directors. I heard it when I was a sub, and I've heard it while I'm a regular player, that when you are a sub, you should come in and check in with the music director early enough and the contractor to let those two people know on a professional level that you're there early, that you care, and that this is important to you. If they know those three things, just because you checked in, you say, hey, I'm here, I want to let you know. They may not, they barely acknowledge you, like, oh, thank you for letting me know. But trust me, it sits. I've had a music director tell me, like, you know, such and such showed up only a few minutes before the show started, and I didn't appreciate that. That person had been there many, many times. It was one time, and for some reason, that particular sub didn't check in with the music director. So it does matter. And with that said, when a music director knows that you're there and that you care and that you're studious, when they come up to the podium and they start getting ready to start the show, they're going to feel confident that you're there. So that's something you should always do is 90%, 95% of that gig that night is you being there on time. No matter what, being late is not an option. So be there plenty early. Let people know, music director, the contractor, that you're there, and everything will be good. That's probably the best advice I have. And playing is a given. You got to kick ass, but you know what I mean.
So I see that you have a T-shirt, which is a diagram of the Ludwig Speed King
Yeah.
bass drum pedal, one of the greatest
Yes.
bass drum pedals to come out. A lot of people used it back in the 60s and 70s, and I had one for a long time. But I'm
Yeah, me
curious as to
too.
what kind of gear do you use right now on Wicked? Did you bring in your drum set, by the way?
I have my drum set over there. I didn't at first. There's the kit. The drums that I'm using are D'Amico drums made by a guy named Gene D'Amico. He's based out of Massachusetts, and it's a custom kit, like Keller shells and beautiful paint job, beautiful drums. I'm using like a 10, a 12, and a 15-inch floor tom. The snare drums are either D'Amico, or I have a what do you call it? A DW Lake Superior drum that sometimes I swap out. But D'Amico drums, and then it's like some Pearl hardware and a rack that belongs to the show. The cymbals are all Sabian that I use, and the sticks are all Vader percussion sticks. The heads are Evans, and yeah, that's about it. So cymbal sticks, heads, and drums are all either D'Amico, Evans, Vader, Sabian, and hardware is like Pearl. That kind
Do
of
you
stuff.
have endorsements with all of these companies?
Not all of them. I have Sabian, D'Amico, Vader. Um, yeah, those are the three main ones. I have a couple others, small ones.
Did you get these endorsements by working on the show, or was it before? How did it all work out?
D'Amico, I used to have a Zildjian endorsement when I was with Defiance, my band, and D'Amico I picked up while I was with my band. Um, so D'Amico and Zildjian I had for a while. Zildjian dropped me eventually. That just kind of fell off the roster, and then I picked up Vader percussion and Sabian when I got Wicked.
Were they looking for you, or did you look for them? How did the relationship come to be?
I went looking for them. I was now playing full time, and you end up spending a lot of money if you're buying sticks, head cymbals at retail. So I was not necessarily looking for someone who's going to promote me as like the Wicked drummer and do seminars and blah blah blah. And I'm going to do TV cameras and lots of spots. I knew that I wasn't that kind of drummer for them. What I wanted was support for a professional musician, and I will support you, you'll support me, and what I need is just a break in the cost, because I know that they don't that this at this stage of the game they were not giving free stuff away, or unless you were like the drummer for the Foo Fighters, you know what I mean? So Sabian cymbals, because cymbals crack and they break and they become very specific, and I really wanted access to the best product for that particular show, and I was willing to pay for them, but I couldn't pay $600 for a crash cymbal because I loved an artisan series or something. So I was um, I was introduced to Andy Zildjian that runs Sabian, and I've subsequently become good friends with him and have hung out with him a bunch of times. And he um, was very helpful in helping me choose cymbals and get set up at Wicked. He was looking to expand Sabian's market share in New York City for endorsees for the Broadway scene. I don't think any of us get stuff free. I mean, maybe some of us do, but I don't. So I always pay at cost for my cymbals and replacements. But Andy had come by the show and had listened and was like, you should choose this, you should choose that. And I was like, I'm looking for this sound. He knew exactly what it was. I mean, that was like a great relationship that I established, because he's hands-on with every single cymbal design at Sabian that comes out. And each time a new product comes out, I was like, so what do you think of this? And he was like, it's this, it's got this kind of color, it's got this kind of crash and the way the cymbal spreads. And I'm like, you think it would work for this and that? And he's like, I'm not so sure for this one. But he had turned me on to this hand hammered raw bell dry ride that I use at the show from Sabian for my ride cymbal. And when I put that thing up, it had enough stick to it that everybody, because I'm behind a booth and an elevator shaft, and people across the other side of the pit could hear the stick and feel it. And then when I'd lay into the bell, they could really hear it. And it worked because I'm from the rock and roll world, which is a bottom up type of player, kick, snare, but a lot of the people on the other side of the pit are jazz players, which is kind of the cymbal top down type of tech, you know what I'm saying? So when I was trying to figure out how can they hear the time on the hi-hat and on the ride cymbal, which is what they're listening to, because they're not used to hearing like boom, ga, ooh, ga. I mean, they hear it, but they're listening to dang, dang, bang, dang, go back at the and gang. That's more of what they're putting their thing on. And a few of these cymbals from Sabian were just like cutting through all of that. And it was like working perfectly. And Andy knew exactly what would cut through for them to be able to hear all that. It was really pretty cool. I mean, a huge proponent of Sabian cymbals, somebody that it's always trying out different stuff in their catalog, is Larry Lely. And he's got a huge wealth of knowledge on like what works here and what works there.
If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
At mattvanderende.com. That's my website.
And how do you spell your last name for those who don't know?
Well, it's Matt, M-A-2-T's, M-A-T-T, Vanderende, VANDERENDE.com. And I have all my updates. I put up like where I'm playing or what's coming up next or what have you.
Thank you, Mr. Vander Ende, for joining me here on Broadway Drumming 101.
Man, thank you for having me. It was like, this is a lot of fun.
Let's just do this again and again and again.
Yeah, I'm with it.
We will talk soon, and I need to come see your show.
Good. Yeah, man.
Well, good luck to you, and we'll definitely talk soon, and I will see you on the Broadway campus.
That's for sure. Good luck to you too, man. I'll talk to you soon.